Okay, so we talked about how this system might be put together here with this hybrid Pro 5 BBJ system and incorporate that with a Node.js application. And so let's take a look at our project here all put together. So we have a simple web-based mobile application, and this is created using a framework called Ionic. It's just another mobile development framework out there, and it's going to be talking to our Node.js server. So this is the application that we're including BBJ and Pro 5 within. So this is going to be talking to a Node.js server using REST API, and then that server is then going to be talking to BBJ to grab data and make various requests in the Pro 5 BBJ realm. And let's take a look at how this works here. So we have a menu here. We can go in and tap on customers. That customer data is actually coming from a Chili Company database, and some of those names may look familiar for those who've messed around in the Chili Company database. We can also look at a list of items from the item table in the Chili Company database. And you can see here these items that probably also look familiar. Now, let's go look at how all of this is put together. So let's start off with our BBJ servlet, so we can see how we're going to expose our BBJ and Pro 5 functionality to the outside world. So the servlet here consists of BBJ code. And what it does here is the first thing it's doing up at the top here, we're including the Jackson JSON parsing libraries, and this will help us out so we don't have to deal with the JSON directly ourselves. Good news for all of you is that the Jackson library is actually built into BBJ, and so you don't need to add that as a third-party dependency. Now this servlet code was taken, it started out from the sample code that's in the online documentation. So I took that as a starting point and then just filled in my specific needs. So that's a great starting point if you need to write your own servlet. So the things of interest here are in the process request for our servlet. We have, we're setting some headers to allow for cross-domain communication with the Node.js server. We need to do that to make sure that assuming that our Node.js server is on a different machine from our BBJ installation, we need to allow that to occur. And so by setting those headers, we allow that to occur. We also want to set our content type to JSON, since that's the communication mechanism that we're going to use to talk to our servlet from the Node.js server. We're going to process post requests here, as you can see, and we're just going to process post requests. Any gets, we'll just ignore those. Okay, so now we're down here in the handle post, and some key points of interest here would be these two lines here. The our request body is going to come from the HTTP request. That's going to contain the JSON, the raw JSON string that that contains the JSON object. And then we're going to use this object mapper, which is from the Jackson library, to parse that string. And then down here, we're going to read in the request body. And we're going to read that into this node bang instance here. And what that does is now we have this in this node bang instance, we can then walk through the various aspects of that JSON object and get the values out of it very easily, as you can see here, with simple get calls specifying attributes. So we get the method name, we decide what method we're going to call, whether that's going to be execute label or execute one of the SQL operations, because our servlet here is going to be able to process SQL requests as well as requests to execute a particular BBJ program starting at a particular label within that program. So let's start off with the execute label here. You can see we go ahead and go through and we process the request and get some various variables out of there. We build a string template. That's how we're going to pass information to the call program that we're going to be calling in just a minute. That makes it easy to create a generic communication mechanism. So then down here, we go ahead and after we've created that that string template, we're going to call the program. So we say call the program that we have, the label, and then pass in the string template variables, and then that will handle that call. So that's what that looks like for processing those call requests. Then our SQL operations, what those will do is they'll create a JDBC connection, prepare the SQL statement that was passed in. It's going to update any parameters. So we allow for parameter queries here. And then we're going to execute that query. And then we're going to iterate through the result set and build a JSON object to return. And that JSON object is going to basically consist of an array of row values that will be passed back to the Node.js server. So that's how the servlet is going to work. And again, that's all written in BBJ. And so now let's take a look at the next piece that we have. And that's going to be the plugin that will communicate with the servlet. So we want to go ahead and make a plugin so that it can be reused easily should we decide to use it again from another Node.js application. And so we've created this simple plugin here, and this is called node.bbj, and you can install this. This is actually available at the npm repository, so you can just install this with npm install node.bbj in your own project and get this sample code there. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, it's very simple. We have a few calls that we're going to expose here, and one is execute label. We're looking at the JavaScript code here. Execute label will create this request object that's going to execute label, passing in the program name, the label, and the variables that we want to set. And then it's going to make a simple HTTP post request here, as you can see, to our servlet. And we'll look at that servlet configuration here in just a moment. And then it's going to process it with whatever JSON is returned. So this is going to call our callback, passing in the parsed JSON data as an object. Very simple there. The execute SQL query is going to do something almost identical. It's going to build a request to call the execute SQL query function within our servlet, passing in the various parameters, and then it's making a post request, and again, it's sending back the results. It's a very, very simple way of bridging the gap between BBJ and Node.js. Finally, our Node server is going to look like this. We've included, now this is using TypeScript here, so which is compiles into JavaScript, transpiles into JavaScript. We import our plugin here up at the top, call that BBJ, and then down here we're going to get the list of customers. And here we're passing in the SQL statement that we plan to execute. We're going to call that execute SQL query on our node module that we just looked at a moment ago, and passing in the various parameters. We're processing it, and then when we send back the list of customer objects, that's going to then be processed by our front-end application. And so you can see there it's very simple to incorporate all of these pieces together. Of course, if you're not familiar with JavaScript or Node.js, then some of this stuff may seem a bit foreign, but you can see here just really how simple it is. It's only a few lines of code in the JavaScript world to actually interact with that servlet that we just created in BBJ. And you notice in that servlet, it's also not a lot of code to get all of that working. Okay, and finally, let's take a look at the servlet configuration and what we need to do to set that up in BBJ. So we have this process BBJ servlet that is going to process all of these requests, and in BBJ we just need to set that up, and that will be done on the context configuration under web, And then what we've done is added a new context called node.bbj. And then we've set that up here. We've enabled it. We've given it the name node.bbj. We set the document base. In this case, we've created a directory here called node.bbj under basis with a web subdirectory that'll contain any HTML files and that kind of thing. We set the path that we want to use for the servlet. That's /node.bbj. We've selected our config.bbx file that we want to use to handle that. In this case, we're not going to use HTTPS, and so we're going to allow insecure connections. We come down here and we need to configure the BBJ servlets that will be utilized in this context. And that contains only one servlet, and that's process. And you can see here process points to the node.bbj process.bbj program that will be processing the servlet requests. And that's basically it. So you can see there it's very simple to configure that. And once that's all set up, then we have our working app that is talking to Node.js via REST calls from this application here that we're seeing. And then that Node.js is then again making calls to the BBJ servlet on the back end to handle processing requests to get data from the BBJ database.